At least 95% of cards on r/custom magic are badly made. Whoa, okay, before you beat me to death with hammers, let's back up a bit. Last time I called someone's card badly made, I got a warning from the mods. Let's try that again. At least 95% of cards on r/custom magic are unfit to print. Is that better? And I don't mean unfit to print as in this creature's power is too high, or this card should cost less mana. I mean that fundamentally, the creator of the card did not take into account the kinds of gameplay patterns that their card would generate, and that the fundamental idea for the card cannot exist. This card cannot see print. This card cannot see print. This card cannot see print. And once again, the issue with these cards are not numerical, they are conceptual. There isn't really a way to quantify the concept of bad design, but there are facets that we can explore. So the question is, what is the difference? What separates a good custom card creator, such as Wendy DeCarlo or Time Spiraled, from your average custom card creator like myself? And most importantly, what makes cards like Grizzly Bears so much more common than cards like Mind's Desire? The answer is that Mind's Desire and many other cards that people create are polarizing. Before we get into this, I need to lay some quick prerequisites. This video will assume that you have fairly intimate knowledge of the mechanics of Magic. If you've seen keywords like modular before, you're probably fit to watch this video. If you're not sure of all the steps in the combat phase, you probably should not be creating custom cards and should focus on actually properly learning the full game before adding to it. Card design is very multifaceted and very complex and requires a lot of experience to know what can and cannot work. As such, this video will be most helpful for those who already have a lot of experience. The definition of polarizing, ignoring the physics definition for a moment here, is to divide or cause to divide two sharply contrasting groups or sets of opinions or beliefs. You're either with me or with them. In balanced terms, this means that a card or strategy has effectively picked a side. It knows what it wants to do and is only good at that. Some decks want more polarizing cards, and some decks want more unpolarizing cards. Polarizing cards can be easily represented by an effectivity distribution graph. Unpolarizing cards are generally always good, regardless of game state, whereas polarizing cards are either really good or really bad. The power of a card is akin to the average effectivity, whereas the polarization is akin to the standard deviation of the effectivity. This is basically just floor and ceiling theory. Unpolarizing cards are reliable and have many different uses. A great example are cantrips, cards like Ponder. Very, very rarely is Ponder a dead draw. The same is true for Lightning Bolt and Questing Beast. These kinds of cards tend to show up in decks that want sheer card quality, like control decks and mid-range decks. Examples of polarizing cards are cards that require building around and lots of support. Technically, most tribal cards are polarizing. Champion of the Parish is pretty useless without human support. Another example is Doomsday, a card which probably just loses you the game unless your deck is perfectly built around it. These kinds of cards are usually found in aggro and combo decks, decks that aim to end the game by abusing high trade-off and situational cards to their fullest potential, in which case they will generally far outclass the generic power of unpolarizing cards. We can draw a political compass, sure, for this. On one axis is power and on the other axis is polarization. In terms of strong unpolarizing cards, we have your reliable efficient spells, like Ponder, Source of Plowshares, Lightning Bolt, etc. Thoughtseize is another good one. These kinds of cards tend to be cheap and widely applicable. They show up mostly in mid-range and control decks and are staples of Legacy Delver decks. Examples of weak unpolarizing cards is a card like Grizzly Bear. It's just a bear. Nothing special about it really. It does what it says on the tin and has a wide range of potential uses, but it's mostly just there to attack and block. But it's really still just a Grizzly Bear, hardly exciting in today's landscape. You see these cards mostly in limited and some weaker standard sets as slot fillers. You're not excited to play Grizzly Bears, but sometimes you have to. Examples of strong polarizing cards are your typical combo and aggro cards that get played in higher power formats. Lion's Eye Diamond, Goblin Guide, the aforementioned Doomsday, and Rest in Peace, assuming there's a good graveyard deck, at least. A good rule of thumb to ask yourself to check for polarization is, would I want this in my average draft deck, ignoring colors for the moment? If the answer is no, it's probably polarizing, because it requires excessive deck building to make work. In the last category, we have weak polarizing cards. These are cards like One with Nothing, Baku's Cursed, and Rest in Peace when there's no graveyard deck. They're situational, but still bad in that situation. These kinds of cards generally see absolutely no play, even in limited, and are usually just forgotten. When designing a card, there are a bunch of example effects that can cause polarization. Here are some examples. A different restriction in the same category, such as murder that only hits planeswalkers, but due to a lack of abundance, popularity, or power of the new target category, the card becomes worse. This encourages the designer to make them better, such as by reducing the mana cost to a single black, and boom, murder for planeswalkers. Useless in most cases, but broken if they have a planeswalker. This one is pretty innocuous because on the surface, you'd think that choosing a different item in a category would be the same thing, but not at all. It's why Source to Plowshares has a long and storied history as the best removal spell ever printed, and Simplify is effectively unplayable. Plus, these days we have Pick Your Poison. Pick Your Poison is also a great example. This card is technically way more efficient than Murder. It kills like three, no, more like 2.5 different types of things for only 1 mana. But artifacts and enchantments and flying creatures are significantly less common than just creatures. Another way to increase the polarization of a card is by increasing both the mana cost and power of a card. Mana curves in Magic aren't linear. It's fairly common to play a 6-drop in Limited, but 8 drops are extremely rare. Similarly, 3 drops are more than 3 times as powerful as a 1-drop. The more mana you make a card, the stronger it should be, but at some point it moves from the realm of this is a fair card that is reasonably attainable to the realm of we are centralizing our game plan on getting this into play. A great example is Big Atraxa. She's ridiculously powerful, but is so much mana that generally the decks playing her are either trying to ramp into her very quickly, such as the standard domain decks of yore, or cheating her into play with ye old reanimation spells. If she were 5 mana and proportionally nerfed, like for example if she was a 3/4 and she only looked at the top 5, there would be more fair decks playing her and looking to use her as a finisher. But 7 mana, especially with those pips, is too far out of reach to not be abusing her, and she is thus polarizing. When was the last time you saw a hardcast Atraxa on turn 7? Barely ever happens. Paradoxically, decreasing the mana cost and power of a card can also lead to this. Our aforementioned Murder example is a good one, but let's use real Magic cards. Disenchant to Erase. You can't really print a 1-mana Disenchant, as that is way too strong for a removal spell, so you have to make it weaker somehow. Sorcery won't cut it, that's still too strong. So now you have to give it more restrictions, only enchantments. Let's ignore the exile clause for now, it's not actually that relevant for this discussion. All this does is make a card more situational, and these kinds of hyper-efficient answers generally end up as sideboard pieces, just like our old friend Murder for Planeswalkers. This is a very common balancing tool that I see on r/custom magic. People will take a card that is broken by concept and just slap a new restriction on it, such as pay 5 life. This does not make a card more balanced, this does not create more interesting gameplay patterns, it just leads to greater blowouts. In general, polarizing cards can be broken up into 2 main categories. 1. Cards with a massive upside and a massive downside. And 2. Cards with a very specific requirement that once met are extremely powerful. Examples of these kinds of cards are Lion's Eye Diamond, Flame Rift, Mox Diamond, Reanimate, and even to an extent, lands like Mana Confluence and City of Brass. These kinds of cards are usually the backbone of combo strategies that aim to abuse the upsides while playing a short enough game that the downsides don't really matter. If these kinds of polarizing cards are badly designed, they either tend to be extremely powerful and ruin formats, or the cost outweigh the risks and even the combo decks don't look at them twice. Oh, and by the way, a downside here is very broadly defined. It can be very obvious, such as Sulfuric Vortex and the previously mentioned Flame Rift, dealing damage to you as well, or they can be more insidious and hard to notice, such as a card costing 1 trillion mana. That's still a downside. Costs can also manifest themselves through tempo loss. Tutors make for great setup, but require you to spend mana to not affect the board or either player's life totals. Demonic Tutor, on paper, you're paying 2 mana and a card to get another card. On paper, Demonic Tutor is horrible. However, we all know Demonic Tutor is a broken Magic card. However, unfair decks use to leverage the extremely high upside in spite of the downside. This downside is irrelevant once the Gristlebrand that you entombed hits play. The last cost that I want to touch on is the card cost, such as with Lotus Petal. Very few decks actually want to play Lotus Petal, as very few decks are willing to pay a card for a mana. However, the decks that do want that last piece of mana want it so much that they're willing to burn their hand in a desperate scrabble for any cheap resources they can generate. However, even this has its limit. Every single time I see a 0-mana artifact get posted, inevitably there will be someone in the chat that says, this is just free storm count. Yes, you're technically right, however Darksteel Relic has never been playable. Just because a card has free storm count does not make it good. And similarly, just because a card thins your deck does not make it good. Deck thinning is irrelevant, however that's outside of the scope of this video. The second category is generally filled with reactive cards and payoff pieces. Examples of these kinds of cards are hyper-specific answers such as Brutal Suppression and the Elder Spell, as well as payoffs such as Tendrils of Agony and my personal GOAT polarizing card, Bearing Glory. This is the epitome of polarizing. It is probably the hardest trigger to put onto the stack in all of Magic, but if you do, it rewards you with winning the game. Aside from that, it does absolutely nothing, and for the privilege of doing nothing, it costs Dreadmaw mana. These kinds of cards tend to be very niche and have significant deck building requirements, such as Goblin Shardbelcher, or basically any companion, except Gigantha, where the problem was that she wasn't polarizing enough, and generally just too easy to make work. That's why she's banned. If these kinds of polarizing cards are badly designed, they tend to be either unplayably niche or stupid good silver bullet sideboard answers. Ironically, if these kinds of cards become too good, it's generally not because they're not restricted enough, making them unpolarizing. Imagine buffing Plummet to destroy any creature. Not as niche as it should be, therefore less polarizing. It's worth noting that these categories are somewhat arbitrary, and you could argue that Category 1 is a subsection of Category 2, or that Category 2 is a subsection of Category 1. After all, Thassa's Oracle has a high upside and a high downside. The upside is winning, and the downside is having a dead card. Similarly, Lion's Eye Diamond is awful until you give it a Dredge card, and then it's amazing. Aside from aiding understanding and making things clear, the reason why these cards are separated is because the cost of Category 2 cards and the downside of Category 1 cards are the same. It's just opportunity cost. You could be playing a different card. And either of these cards are dead in your hand, such as Flame Earth when you're 3 life, or Deathmark against Mono Red. You could be playing a different card. We all want to make cool, splashy cards, but generally the more powerful an effect is, the harder it is to depolarize. Let's start off with a payoff as an example. Say, discard your opponent's hand. You could put this effect straight up on a spell or an ETB, but it would likely be very expensive. So you'd probably end up cheating it out or with it dead in your hand. This is Category 1. The best example of this is my beloved Hypnox. You could also put more restrictions on it and make it cheaper, so there's a higher chance it will see normal play, such as with Mind Slicer. Mind Slicer is harder to trigger as it's a death trigger on a creature, and it's symmetrical. But then it once again just becomes super weak unless you fulfill that requirement, in which case it becomes overpowered. This is Category 2. So why do I think that 95% of custom Magic cards are unprintable? Because they are polarizing in an unfun way. Polarizing cards need carefully curated environments and active attention paid to design. Look through the most recent set, in my case, Edge of Eternity. Most of the cards are not polarizing. Even the starships at least have an ETB or a static ability. They at least do something if you have nothing to crew them with. Edge of Eternity actually isn't that great of an example, because starships echo vehicles and not in a good way. Vehicles were famously underpowered because their requirement of having a creature was simply too high. Well, I guess except for Looter Scooter and Heart of Kieran. So when it comes to custom card design, keep this in mind, because the vast majority of cards printed in Magic are not polarizing. Therefore, the vast majority of cards you should be designing should not be polarizing. In small doses, polarizing cards are great for the game because they provide sledgehammers needed to beat certain archetypes, such as Enchantment Hate against Enchantress, and combo cards to keep down value piles that will overrun all other midrange decks. They also provide fun deck building challenges and restrictions. Some are very obvious restrictions, such as companions, and some are softer, such as Tendrils of Agony, needing a cohesive pile of fast mana and card velocity to work properly. But in large doses, polarizing cards tend to lead to non-games of, they had the answer, I didn't. And I'd love to play that format, but it's just turn 1 kills. Looking at you, Legacy Hoops. There's a reason that we have so many fewer Doomsdays than we do Grizzly Bears. There can only be so many Allurans and so many Labmans before the game becomes a big contest of who can combo faster and Silver Bullet harder. So this is my issue with the vast majority of r/custom Magic cards. They are too polarizing. You cannot just stick a massive cost on a massive upside and declare the card balanced. It's not. You cannot just put a massive qualifier on a massive upside and call the card balanced. It's not. To design better cards, you need to design cards with less splashy effects. Embrace elegance and reject effects that turn the game on its head. If you want to design better Magic cards, use less text. As a final note, this is also fully applicable to deck building and probably deserves its own video in and of itself. Since polarizing cards have higher highs and lower lows, you really need to have a plan when you put them into your decks. Playing polarizing cards wrong is one of the biggest mistakes that I see with bad commander deck builders. They take cards from higher power levels and assume that they can go into low power decks without knowing their context. Many cards are broken in higher power and awful in low power because decks aren't built to abuse them. If you're playing Bracket 2, do not play Dark Ritual or Lotus Petal. These kinds of cards need a very well-built deck to slot into, and if all you're doing is ramping out your commander a little earlier, you're not making your deck stronger. You're just making it more of a removal check. Imagine Dark Ritualing your 4-mana commander on turn 2, and then if they immediately die, now you're down a card and your commander's 6 mana. Considering how much the average commander deck is built around eating their commander, you probably lose the game. That's not what you want at your casual commander table. Sorry Kyle, get better at deck building, you